stringent criteria for beneficiaries imposed by the Department of Social Welfare. And part of the problem with this stringent criteria that is being imposed by the Department of Social Welfare and the government, and it's not reaching the beneficiaries because of that, is this absurd notion of targeted poverty alleviation programs that has been pushed down our throat by development banks, development agencies, and international financial institutions. He has also announced around uh, uh, 25 billion pesos for a war chest to fight COVID. But much of this money, about $14 billion, 14 billion pesos, is going to the tourism budget to bail out companies in the tourism sector. Meanwhile, as I said, mass testing is only going to be started this April 14. We have a population of around 109 million people. We have only 6 testing centers across the country. In early March, only 2,000 testing kits were available, and Duterte's family and his cronies were given preferential treatment, even though for the use of these test kits, even though they didn't meet the Department of Health criteria. And this was a huge scandal all over the papers, all over the TV, all over social media, where these test kits were essentially being plundered, 2,000 test kits essentially being plundered by Duterte and his cronies for their own personal use. So there was a public outcry and demands for substantial testing, including mass testing. We launched a national campaign for mass testing in the communities. And under this massive public pressure, the government has now agreed to conduct mass testing beginning April 14. And part of the outrage, the motivation and outrage of people is also because of the experience of other countries in the region. They see the reports, they learn in the news about how South Korea and Vietnam have been fairly successful in flattening the curve or however they describe it. And one of the main reasons was because of the substantial testing that they have carried out. Vietnam has had no fatalities to date, as far as we know. Well, our scientists responded very fast. The University of the Philippines developed a test kit within a matter of a couple of weeks, much cheaper than the international prices of these test kits. But this was bogged down again in the bureaucracy, and it took the Department of Health about 3 to 4 weeks to validate these test kits. They have now been validated, and we're trying to get, and some of these will be used on the 14th of April, but there are still problems with the bureaucratic red tape and so on. Now, the mayors at the local level are really feeling the pressure of this as well. The money isn't coming down. This 275 billion pesos that Duterte has managed to amass around himself through his special powers has not gone down to the local mayors. And under absolute, and there's a lot of desperation, a lot of pressure, and the mayors are starting to take their own initiative. Some of the mayors that we backed in the last election campaign and who won have taken a number of initiatives, including paying workers who are being laid off full salaries, hazard pay, mobilizing tricycles so that the health workers and emergency personnel can get to work. And these essentially go against the regulations imposed by the Duterte regime. And also setting up testing centers. They've basically converted hospitals and so on, quickly set up some labs with local experts, with the universities in their areas. Now, the Department of Health has refused to endorse any of these testing centers so far. They're basically trying to they've basically blocked it. And anyway, these mayors are under enormous pressure. They're taking initiatives, and the Duterte regime has come out, and Duterte in a press conference a couple of weeks ago said that that if these mayors did not strictly comply by these regulations, and that included tricycles to be allowed to take emergency workers to work, that was one of the things that he did not want to happen, that these mayors would be arrested and would filed with criminal charges. Now, the impact of the crisis on workers and the urban poor, as you can expect, has been devastating. Hunger has increased, suicides has increased, and in a very conservative Catholic country. Food relief is not coming from the government. The LGUs and barrios are using calamity funds, private donations, whatever funds that they can get their hands on to distribute food relief. And this is essentially a few kilos of rice and canned goods. Staying at home is not an option for people, for a majority of people in the Philippines. Staying at home is just not an option. And recently, some residents in one of the urban poor communities close to us, the city of San Roque, they just mobilized, walked out of their homes, walked out of their communities, took over one of the major highways demanding food. They were arrested, but once again, because of public pressure, they have been released, and it worked. They were released because there was enormous public pressure. People just brought donations and paid their bail, and then people just brought food, and it actually worked, and it was a little success story. And there was one comment that was made by one of the leaders of this. It was a spontaneous gathering, a spontaneous mobilization. The left had mass organizations in the area. We joined it, our members joined it, but it really was a spontaneous action. And there was one of the leaders of it who said, "I'm not afraid of COVID-19. What's frightening us is dying with our eyes open because of hunger." And that is essentially the sentiment in the country of the Masa today. Our relief, of course, our relief operations are ongoing. We started it from day one. We've continued it every day, including the Easter holidays where everything is locked down in Catholic Philippines. We started with the homeless, and now we have expanded it to other urban poor areas. And of course, we make sure that our base is also secured. The Department of Labor and Employment has announced a one-time financial assistance of 5,000 pesos for every worker, which is about $3 per day for 30 days. But again, this is rigged because the employers have to apply for it. Workers can't apply for it directly, and workers in the informal and workers who are outside Metro Manila, who are now stranded from their workplaces because of the lockdown, can't apply for it from outside Metro Manila. Informal sector workers are given no assistance, and so on. Meanwhile, in the height of all this, the Department of Social Welfare came out several weeks ago and temporarily suspended its poverty alleviation cash grants to the poorest families in the country. I should also add that the regime is also facing a political crisis of sorts. We have a sick president. He's extremely ill with liver cancer. He rambles at daily press conferences, possibly beats the ramblings of Donald Trump. A couple of days ago, he came out on national TV and declared that there was no money in the coffers. He didn't know what to do. He was going to sell all government's assets to be able to raise money. But the problem is most of the valuable government assets have already been sold as a result of privatization. The only place he could point to was the cultural center of the Philippines. Meanwhile, the international financial institutions are lining up with loans. The Asian Development Bank is providing a $1.6 billion loan to the Philippines for its COVID response. All these loans are hard money. That is, they're not grants, they're not low interest or whatever. These are all high interest loans, which means debts are going to grow. These loans, we have no reason to believe, we have absolutely no confidence to believe, given the record of elite governments, given the record of this government, that we will see any substantial amount of that money being used for COVID response, it's very likely that a big proportion of that money will be plundered by various factions of the elite. Meanwhile, we still have the debt appropriation law, which is 1/3 of the national budget automatically for debt servicing. And we are calling for a moratorium on this debt appropriation law, which has been a historic demand of the movement. In terms of the left and progressive movement has been campaigning against Duterte's military response to a public health crisis and has put forward a platform of demands that includes mass testing for all, free hospitalization for victims, mass disinfection in all communities, food and water rationing for workers and the poor, distribution of face masks, hygiene kits, vitamins, contraceptions, assistance to farmers, drivers, and affected workers, paid emergency leave for uninsured workers, refunding tuition to students due to class exemption, price controls on commodities, electricity, water, and communications to be provided 24/7, allowing vehicles and tricycles to provide transport to medical workers and people with medical needs, suspension of rent, water, electricity, communication, and other fees, disarming the large numbers of military and police deployed so as not to cause terror to the people, and a debt moratorium. Now, how am I going for time?
Thanks very much, Rahana.
I've just got a couple more things. Do I have a little bit more time?
Yeah, just wind up there.
Okay.
And we'll get on to the next speaker.
All right. Today, some general comments before I wind up. Today, we face a multiple intersecting crisis, a public health crisis triggered by the pandemic, an economic crisis with many leading financial institutions expecting this to be the worst recession in living memory, and the climate crisis and coronavirus crisis needs to be considered as a part of the climate crisis, and very much so. And of course, the climate crisis and the impacts of that will continue. We have in the Pacific a few days ago, we had massive cyclones. It's not like we're going to be stopping in the height of this, that the climate impacts and extreme weather events are going to stop. Massive cyclones in Fiji, Vanuatu, and so on. These intersecting crises signal a major socioeconomic crisis, and some analysts have even said a collapse of the capitalist system. I think this is very much highlighted in the situation in the US today, the center of global capitalism, the epicenter of the crisis, which is now providing the baseline for the worst case scenario, with over 500,000 cases of infected cases and over 18,000 deaths, and coming at over 2,000 deaths per day, a big majority of these African Americans. We also think that the rising authoritarianism and the provisions that are put in place from Hungary to Britain to Chile to Israel to the US and the Philippines and other countries where speakers are speaking from today could shape politics for decades to come. The corona crisis has highlighted the fact that continuing on the capitalist path, including some reform social democratic version of it, is no longer an option. And as we struggle for our immediate demands, we also need to put forward a socialist alternative. And we think that solidarity has to be an essential core of this socialist vision. And Cuba sets an example for the world today in how this socialist vision can be described and visualized. Finally, there will be sporadic and spontaneous combustions as people protest and resist in their struggle to survive. This is inevitable. The next steps and tasks in the Philippines today are framed by posing the following questions. Who will lead the rising opposition against Duterte? Is the political opposition with their electoral forces ready for it? Is the organized left with their mass organizations positioned and willing to lead? Are there still military
just let you know,
rebels
Nando came around and we did the little film for Kiara.
The various groups might as well merge with the rising opposition against Duterte if they are not placed to lead it. Now is the time to be tested. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rahana. Welcome everyone to this forum that Green Left and Socialist Alliance has organised. There's some new people here who've come on late. We've just heard from Rahana Mohideen from the Party of Labouring Masses in the Philippines. Thanks very much, Rahana. And we're hosting, Green Left and Socialist Alliance are hosting online forums in the time of COVID-19, replacing our normal physical forums that we conduct in all major Australian cities. The event is streamed on the Green Left Facebook page, so people can go and share it there. And we've just heard from Rahana, thank you very much. And we're moving on to hear from Dr. Michael Giacomo Devarge, often referred to as the Red Doctor. Dr. Kumar is a medical doctor by profession and chairperson of the Socialist Party of Malaysia. He served in the Parliament of Malaysia as MP for the Sungai Siput constituency in Perak for 2 terms, from 2008 to 2018. Well known to authorities, Jayakumar and other PSM members were arrested in June 2011 for allegedly trying to wage war against the king and revive communism. A month later, he was arrested again and spent 28 days in detention. Let's welcome Dr. Kumar.
Hello, Rachel. Do you get me? Am I online?
You're good.
Do you see me?
Thanks, comrade. You're good.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to participate in this online forum, Socialist Alliance. I'll try and keep it within 15 minutes so there's more time for questions. I was asked to comment on the situation in Malaysia. If you look at this chart, you see it, if we can see it. The red line here shows Malaysia, and with our 4,300 and something cases and our total deaths of 70, we seem to be doing fairly all right when you compare with other countries, for example, especially in Europe, where you find the number of cases, even cases per million population in the UK, for example, is much higher than ours. And also the case fatality ratio, where in the UK, for example, 12.3% of all the cases have died already. Our rate of 1.6 is not too high, So if you look at these kind of figures, Malaysia seems to be containing the epidemic to a reasonable extent. Some of these other countries like Philippines and India, we really doubt whether all the cases are being diagnosed. That's another question, but that's another issue altogether. Now, the reason why Malaysia is doing relatively better is because we didn't believe, our authorities didn't believe in this diagram. This diagram gives the impression that if you just do mitigation, you allow the epidemic to develop and infect people, but you keep it below a certain amount, then you're below this line, which is the capacity of your healthcare system, and that'll be enough. And only since you have only 1% deaths, you get through and finally have herd immunity. This is what Boris Johnson and the group in Britain tried to think of before. Now, the problem is that this line is drawn too high. The actual capacity of the healthcare system is this line, the red line below. So if you really want to keep below the curve, then you have to have much lower number of cases. And at that rate, it will take about 50, 60 years to have the epidemic go through your whole population. So you might as well suppress and wait for the vaccine, which is what Malaysia is doing, which is what a lot of countries in East Asia are doing as well, in Vietnam, in Taiwan, in Japan. The thing is that this reasoning is flawed because this line, the infographic, is drawn too high. The real line is down here. And because they moved on this, now many countries in Europe are above this line. And that's why you get those horrendous mortality rates of over 10% in Italy, in Spain, in Britain, So I think we were lucky our government didn't believe in this. We took the line that was taken in China and taken in Korea, that we have to suppress. And so there's mitigation. And we have been on a lockdown since 18th of March. Now we are into the 4th week of the lockdown. And these are the figures of new cases per day over the last 10 days. So in the 2nd of April, we had something like 207 cases, but yesterday it's come down to about 100 and I think 118 or so. So there seems to be a downward trend, but the government is extending the movement control order, our version of the lockdown, for another 2 weeks to the end of the month. And on the whole, if you look, there was a survey done yesterday among the public. On the whole, most people support what the government is doing. They appreciate that we do need some kind of a lockdown to prevent the spread of this disease, as it can be spread by people who are fairly asymptomatic. People who don't have a fever, people who don't have much cough, people who feel they're well, who don't know they're ill, can actually be transmitting, can be emitting viruses and transmitting it. So the only way to kind of bring it down to manageable levels is to have this lockdown, bring levels in, for Malaysia below 50 per day for the whole country before we can ease on it. Now, what has the PSM done? Well, PSM, on the 13th of March, we called for a roundtable discussion together with some of our partners in the People's Health Forum. That's a group of about 5 NGOs, including the PSM. And we had a discussion on what the government should do, what the country should do to manage the COVID epidemic. And from that discussion, we came up with the memorandum with a number of ideas that should be followed by the government. So one of the things that we talked about was income support, for people who are under quarantine for 2 weeks. Income support for people affected by the lockdown because they can't go to work. We asked for help for small businesses. And interestingly, the government has actually implemented all of these. There is a policy now just being implemented that 4 million of the poorest families in Malaysia would be given 1,600 into the bank accounts. Now, to put this in perspective, the minimum wage in Malaysia is 1,002. The median factory income is about 1,007. So 1,600 per family is a fair amount. In terms of getting food for them for the next 1.5 months, this would help. The government also announced something we asked for. We asked for a moratorium of all loans. There are many Malaysians who bought houses and other things, hire purchase, and they'll face problems in paying these loans. And we asked for a moratorium on loans, which the government has come to in its policy. The government has said that all loans, housing loans, whatever personal loans, there'll be a moratorium till the end of the year, where interest will be accrued and added to the loan amount, but payments are not required now, and banks and other institutions are barred from taking legal action on these loans. We also asked in our memorandum, the memorandum that was endorsed by 42 NGOs that PSM and the other groups put forward, that the small and medium enterprises should get assistance because they form the backbone of the country. 2/3 of them, more than that, but 70% of them have less than 50 employees. They're small, but yet they provide about 2/3 of the employment of the country. So they would have problems with meeting the wage bill. So we asked the government for easy credit for these small and medium enterprises. And what we were pleased to see was the government has actually come out with a number of programs for them. One is a cash credit of $3,000 for about, I think it's 800,000 small enterprises, plus terms of easy credit, plus assistance in paying the 1,200 towards the wages of the workers of these small and medium enterprises. So a number of things the government did. There's one thing that we brought up in our memorandum, which the government hasn't really acted upon, that was pertaining to migrant workers. You see, in Malaysia, we have about 6 million migrant workers, of which 2/3 are undocumented, are without proper passports and visas. And this 6 million complement the 15 million of Malaysians in the job market. Now, right now, migrant workers live in fear of the government. They are afraid to come forward because they will have, they are afraid that they would be arrested, detained, and deported. So we tell the government to have a moratorium on all immigration offences, open the doors of our hospitals so they can get free treatment, so that if the disease spreads to them, then they won't be the conduit where it goes to the whole country. So now actually the PSM is in a strange situation where we have come out a few times in the past month in support of some of the policies that the government has actually announced, because we think they are fair policies where you have some kind of support for poorer people, you have testing, and you have, and the government seems to be quite sober. It's listening to the professionals, and certain missteps they have actually corrected themselves. There was, for example, in the early days of the lockdown, they wanted to arrest people who were breaking the lockdown rules and were putting them in remand. And when groups spoke out saying this is not going to help, they withdrew that. They were saying NGOs could not go and deliver food because that again goes against social distancing. But when NGOs spoke up against that, they've revised that. So they seem to be fairly responsive. And we have a daily update by the Director General of Health, which is quite reassuring. It talks about the number of new cases, number of deaths, and all that. The Prime Minister has come out with statements about 3 or 4 times in the last 3 weeks, quite reassuring to the people. I think on the left, what we got to see is this COVID-19 epidemic is going to be a game changer. It has actually upended the entire capitalist system. And this disruption is going to continue. Even in Malaysia, if after another 2 weeks can bring the levels down to where we can relax the movement control order, we still have to be careful because we don't have herd immunity and we can import cases. We have a long porous border with Indonesia. Cases from Indonesia come over to us because a lot of workers coming from there to work here. It can come in from international travelers. So it cannot be back to business as normal. Obviously, international travel, our airlines are going to be affected. The tourism sector is going to be badly hit. Higher education, where we have a lot of people coming from overseas, is going to be hit. Mass functions, whether it's weddings, social functions like that, or religious functions. So it's going to be a major downturn in our Malaysian economy, and I guess in the global economy. There's going to be job losses. In Malaysia, we are part of the global supply chain. There's going to be a lot of job losses and unemployment. So the question is, in this situation, how are the resources of society going to be used? Are they going to be used to protect capital and the rich people? Or are they going to be used to make sure that the poorer people, that all the people in the country have enough food, have enough health care, can meet their basic needs? And that's where the contest is going to be. And I think when we try to mobilize people saying that the resources of our country, of our society, have to be used to protect the basic needs, the food for the people, that's, I think, going to get a lot of resonance. And I think that's how we got to pitch it. We got to pitch it in language that people can understand, that at this time of crisis, the government cannot worry about maintaining the profits of the rich. That we have to focus on the basic needs of the poor. No one should go hungry, including foreign workers. No one should go without health care. No one should go without water. Housing should not be deprived. And so we got to talk in terms of, if people can't find jobs, there's got to be UBI, Universal Basic Income. And you're going to give universal basic income to people. Why not then employ those people to do things that are socially required? We need to reforest. Our forests in Malaysia have been badly logged. We need to clean up our waste dump sites, our landfills, and have hygienic landfills. We need to clean up the urban flats in our urban areas, which have become into urban ghettos. So we're going to give universal basic income to people. Why don't we use that manpower to do the cleaning up, do the work that our society needs? Now, that's the kind of packaging that we are trying to put forward to people, to get people on board a program, economic program that is meant for the masses and not for the top 1%. So that I think what we should do. Last thing I think we should say, I think as a group, as the left in Asia and Australia, we should look at areas like the Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, where the Rohingyas are going to face a real problem, and do a content campaign to raise money and do work with Doctors Without Frontiers to address problems there, because I think things there can get very bad, and showing solidarity in that real way may be good for us as a movement. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thanks very much, Dr. Kumar. That was great, very inspiring and informative. Thank you very much. We go now to Kavita Krishnan, a socialist activist and well-known spokesperson for the movement against sexual violence in India. Kavita is the secretary of the All India Progressive Women's Association and a leading member of the Communist Party of India, Marxist-Leninist. Kavita was due to visit us in Australia for the Eco-Socialism 2020 conference that Green Left and Socialist Alliance were organising until this global pandemic put that to an end, at least temporarily. And while we hope to have her here soon, we are really lucky to have her speaking to us over Zoom. Welcome, Kavita.
And, listening to the reports from the Philippines and Malaysia, I'm struck by the similarities in the response of governments on the global south, especially the Philippines. And very many of the entire mode of response, which is draconian rather than democratic, and which has signally failed to contain the COVID-19 pandemic and has instead unleashed a whole lot of other distress in the name of a response. That's really something that India has in common, especially with the Philippines. So I'll just sort of try and outline quickly what's been going on here. See, the Indian government had at least a first case of COVID-19 on January 30th. So they knew that was happening. But the government of India deliberately suppressed the information, didn't warn anybody, made no preparations that we know of. And instead, they spent the whole of February hosting Trump, hosting large rallies for Trump, gatherings for Trump, and even backing political violence, Islamophobic violence against the minority Muslim community in Delhi. Come March, also, the government did not react. The central government did not react till 22nd of March, when they announced a one-day lockdown, and then suddenly a day later announced a 21-day lockdown with no warning at all. Some of the state governments had already begun to announce lockdowns somewhere beginning around mid-March, but these were poorly understood, poorly communicated. People didn't really know what exactly was going on. And the result of all this has been pretty predictable, which is that you have this unplanned lockdown that has left millions of migrant workers completely taken unawares, completely taken by surprise. And so they are stuck in cities and towns all over the country without jobs, without any way of earning, and without any means of getting back home. So you have, so essentially the unplanned nature of the dramatic, draconian nature of the lockdown has in fact resulted in situations where the very purpose of the lockdown has been undercut. So you have had huge crowds of migrant workers trying to walk home, hundreds of kilometers home in order to try and make it back to their villages. And you have situations where there are hungry communities all over the country, desperate hunger, really a desperate situation. Just as Rihanna described in the Philippines, I mean, you have street hawkers and so on. They have no means to survive. The majority of workers in India are in the informal sector, and they have been left completely, left in the lurch by this unplanned lockdown. The other thing is that the lockdown period ought to be used, in other countries where it is actually being used to, you're flattening the curve so that you use that time that you're buying in order to shore up your medical system, in order to do widespread testing and tracing and treating of the COVID-19 cases so that you're able to contain and isolate that. That is not happening in India. India has some of the lowest testing in the world. And it's unclear why the government of India was caught in a corruption scandal, in the manufacture of testing kits. And now also it is unclear why testing kits are so expensive, 4,500 rupees or so. And so it's essentially out of reach for most people. And there's no transparency in who is being tested and why. And there never was. And India had very poor screening, very poor testing, and continues to do that, continues to have that. The other thing is that the medical system is India's medical system was already highly privatized. The public health infrastructure was always under pressure. And now, in the words of Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez of the US, this pandemic has poured gasoline on the existing problems. So you have a situation where the health infrastructure is under enormous stress, where doctors and nurses and sanitation workers and so on are desperately saying that we don't have masks, we don't have PPE kits, we don't have basic protections. And so you have entire hospitals having to shut down because the doctors and the medical staff have been affected by the pandemic. And not to mention the risks to which you're putting sanitation workers, health workers. India has a huge battalion of health workers who are women, ASHA workers they are called, who are in rural India, who are the frontline fighters in this fight, and yet they don't even get a basic salary, let alone any kind of pandemic pay or any kind of protection, or even safe transport. So there's all of this. The other thing that is happening is that the central government's response has been to shore up its authoritarianism, which it already had, to shore up its Islamophobia, and to shore up its endorsement of inequality and its propagation of inequality and utter cruelty. So what you're having is, this is a government which is an extremely sort of, it is a cult. There's a cult figure of Modi at the center. So Modi is washing his hands of all responsibility for actually containing the pandemic. And his belated responses have been limited to asking people to, he borrows all these strategies which people have adopted in various parts of the world, like Italy and Brazil and so on, which are either protest tactics or they are, displays of public support for health staff and so on. And he has sort of borrowed them, and he's made them into these fascist spectacles here. So he's asked people to stand on their balconies and clap, or bang plates, or light candles, and so on and so forth. And essentially, that is it. The relief package the central government has announced belatedly is absolutely a joke. It's a farce completely. And the relief work has largely been left to people. So it's trade unions like ours and any number of social and even religious organizations that have stepped up to the plate, that are desperately trying to provide relief and provide help to stranded migrant workers, to hungry communities, and so on. The central government has completely just looked the other way, hasn't even bothered to mention this. Some state governments have, really shown a better response, but they are also drowning in struggle because they were also taken by surprise. They had no time to plan. And all these governments, by the way, are opposition-ruled governments. The governments ruled by the BJP, the ruling party, have shown some of the worst responses possible to the pandemic. Now, you have a situation right now in India where the number of COVID-19 deaths has crossed 200. The number of confirmed cases is, I think, around 6,000 plus. But the point is that because your testing is so low, you don't really know the scale and size of all this at all, because the testing is absolutely low. But on the other hand, the lockdown-related deaths are also very high in number, difficult to calculate. But I just want to quickly read through the various heads under which you could classify these deaths. So deaths due to interstate travel, so migrant workers traveling on foot and dying in road accidents and so on. Alcoholism related deaths, suicides due to alcoholism, alcohol withdrawal, suicides due to COVID-19 panic, lockdown lynchings, so lynch mobs attacking Muslims. I'll talk about that a little bit more a little later. Lockdown related hunger deaths, suicides due to livelihood issues, police brutality deaths, suicides due to police brutalities, domestic violence resulting in deaths, and deaths due to the denial and lack of access to regular medical care, including even care for cancer or care for other chronic and very serious illnesses, all of which has completely shut down. Everything has been diverted only towards COVID-19, and even that is really in bad shape. So with all this, the other thing I want to quickly mention when I have the time, I think I have a few minutes left, the other thing I want to quickly flag here is that the central government, right from the top, has been suppressing information, denying any kind of transparency, and instead of acknowledging any responsibility itself, has tried to communalize, which means to give an Islamophobic spin to the pandemic. So they have tried to claim that it is a Muslim gathering in Delhi that is responsible for India's pandemic problem. And so, helped by corporate media that is largely in the central government's and Narendra Modi's pockets, they have managed to establish this narrative, toxic narrative, which is resulting in social boycotts of Muslim street vendors, Muslim-owned shops, and even lynch mob violence, which was happening even earlier on other pretexts. Now this is a fresh pretext for violence against Muslims. There's also, India has always had an untouchability problem, big time, so caste-based untouchability. Now that has expanded. So essentially poor people, people who are suspected, there's enormous stigma associated with COVID-19, partly because of this high-pitched Islamophobic campaign and criminalizing of COVID-19 by the state. So the point is that if people are trying to suppress information because they feel that that will result, they're looking at quarantine as an arrest and the quarantine as a detention camp, that kind of thing. And the quarantine conditions are also terrible for most of the people, for most of the poor people. So they try to avoid that. And as a result, you're having, because of the criminalization and the stigma associated with this, and the sheer untouchability that not only COVID-19 patients or those in quarantine or those suspected of having been exposed to the virus, but even healthcare workers, sanitation workers, doctors, nurses, you name it. All of them are experiencing stigma. They're being thrown out by landlords. They are being denied basic services and so on. So essentially, untouchability in India has got a fresh lease of life in all this. So with the little time that I have left, I'm hoping that okay, 10 minutes are up, so I have 5 minutes left. Let me take the rest of the time to quickly flag some other stuff here. So the ILO and the United Nations have warned that as a result of India's pandemic-related lockdown, around 40 crore, that is 400 million Indians, are likely to descend into poverty, which means that apart from those who are already in poverty, you're going to have this enormous, push into poverty. They're going to be shoved into poverty overnight, virtually. The staying power of India's poor, because most of them are daily wagers with no income, no other income, no savings. The staying power is extremely poor. And so you have this enormous crisis of food, rations, you name it. Even giving rations is not enough, as we have found, because even if you give rations, people have run out of fuel, so they're unable to cook the food. I want to quickly flag here the fact that the remarkable role that various activists have been playing, and I want to talk briefly about the role that CPIML and AICCTU comrades have been, our trade union comrades have been playing. So, for instance, our CPIML MLA, from Jharkhand, he's the member of the Legislative Assembly, Vinod Singh. He has single-handedly responded to tens of thousands of phone calls from migrant workers and from distressed people. Similarly, our Legislative Assembly members, 3 of them in Bihar, have also been, facing the responding directly to distress calls from distressed communities, hungry communities, and migrant workers. And then from day one, we had to scramble to respond to the sudden announcement of a lockdown. But we did manage to establish a network and a team all over the country, responding to the lockdown and providing relief, which the state had signally failed to provide. So the real issue right now is that we are demanding that, because it looks like the lockdown is going to be extended, we are putting out a charter tomorrow. I want to end by saying that tomorrow, Modi had asked people to bang plates and so on. Now, banging plates is a form of protest which the left movement and people's movements in India have used for a long time to signal hunger and price rise and so on. So tomorrow, in fact, April 12th, all over the country, poor communities are going to respond by banging plates and telling Modi, all right, you asked us to do it, we did it then, but as an act of solidarity for doctors. But now we are doing it because those plates we banged are completely empty now. So you have to do home delivery of rations. You have to ensure that people get wages, that people's rents are waived during this crisis. You have to ensure that we get the medical care that we need, quite apart from COVID-19, as well as pre-COVID-19 testing and COVID-19 treatment. But also other kinds of treatment can't be suspended during this time. And we also want to stop to the draconian police-driven response. And we want a consultative approach this time, in which people who are actually working in the front lines of delivering rations and help are helped, not hindered, are involved and not hindered in their work. Thank you. I'll sign off here.
Thanks very much, Kavita. That was very thorough and sobering, but very inspiring talk. Thank you very much. Finally, we're going to hear today from Dr. Hoyshen Aziz, a Kurdish academic and feminist who specializes in gender and Middle Eastern studies. Hoyshen is currently teaching in the American University in Iraq. Hoyshen relocated to Kobani in 2015 and remained there until early 2018, during which time she worked to help rebuild Kobani amid repeated ISIS attacks and massacres. Hoyshen witnessed the rise of democratic confederalism and the Rojava revolution firsthand. She has written and published widely on democratic confederalism, Kurdish liberation, the YPG, YPJ, feminism, and more. We are very happy to have you in this discussion. Please welcome Hoyshen, everyone.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm very, very humbled by that introduction. Thank you. I hope everybody can hear me properly. Thank you to the previous speakers. It has been very, very enlightening to hear them speak. And like Dr. Kavita mentioned in her presentation, what the previous speakers have said in relation to their respective countries is eerily similar to what is happening here in Iraq at the moment. I'm going to attempt to try to break down my presentation into two parts. I'm going to try to focus on both Iraq and Iran. Initially, I wanted to spend equal amounts of time focusing on both countries, but having heard what some of the speakers have said, I think I'm going to try to focus more on Iran, because I think the anomaly situation in Iran is something that we haven't seen so far, and it really needs to be discussed, whereas Iraq has followed a very similar trajectory to India, to Malaysia, to Philippines in relation to its response to COVID. Just before I commence into my presentation, I just want to highlight a number of things. As of last night, there was a bit of a trigger warning as well. A gang rape of a Kurdish woman in detention by Iraqi special forces and police forces. This particular rape was recorded and released via social media, exasperating existing ethno-religious issues and conflicts. And the last day or so, we've also had a 15-year-old Yazidi boy who was killed in Germany. He was a survivor of the ISIS attacks and the ISIS genocide of the Yazidi people. This links back to another massacre that occurred less than a month ago in Germany towards a number of Kurdish refugees from the Kurdish parts of Turkey who had been killed as a result of fascist attacks towards them. At the same time, in the last few days, we've seen a number of ISIS attacks, terrorist organizations who are actually reviving and trying to use the period of quarantine to attempt to implement their own particular objectives. So my point in highlighting these number of cases is that a lot of minority communities, a lot of indigenous communities, ethnic and religious minorities are attempting to survive the period of quarantine, survive this global pandemic in light of a background of extreme oppression, violence, attempting to survive genocide, and attempting to live in an environment that consistently and systematically erases them, silences them, kills them, and basically attempts to engage in a number of intersecting layers of oppression and violences. This is also important to highlight because I think we need to touch on the fact that the global pandemic has had a gendered impact, and we should probably attempt to focus on how the pandemic has had an impact in relation to women and how women have been influenced by this global pandemic. But let me just briefly go into some details and figures in relation to Iraq. I'll start off with Iraq and then I'll go into Iran. Iraq has had a very, very similar response to the global crisis. It has been marred by a period of anti-government protest, anti-colonial protest against Iranian influences, as well as British and American influences in late 2019. So we've had a period where we've actually not had any form of government, centralized government whatsoever. As a result of the Tahrir Square protest, pro-democracy protest, the government had resigned and we were in a stage of attempting to try to find an alternative cabinet. So there are multiple layers of confusion, there are multiple layers of inconsistencies and problems, political and social problems made much, much worse by lack of having a centralized government. At the same time, here in the northern part, we have the Kurdistan regional government, which is almost a shadow state in comparison to the rest of Iraq. So we've had two varying types of responses in Iraq in relation to the pandemic. Very, very similar to what is happening in the rest of the other three countries. The Iraqi government and the Kurdistan regional government were completely unprepared and implemented quarantine measures very, very, very late. One of the major problems that caused a huge spike in increases in the number of people who were infected were the fact that the borders between Iran and Iraq were not closed. Now, the reason why I also wanted to talk about Iran is that the Iran and Iraq regimes and states are extremely intertwined politically, socially, economically, ethnic and religious-wise. So it's almost impossible to discuss Iraq without also discussing Iran. And so as a result of this connection, there were a large number of people who were flying between Iran and Iraq and the Shiite religious sites. And so the very first case that was infected here in Iraq was somebody who had returned from the religious site of Qum, where a number of Shiite shrines are placed in the city. And so the lack of preparation has caused a number of issues within society. And like some of the other countries, Iraq has not made any suggestions in relation to providing any sort of a financial support to those who are impacted. At the same time, we have a large, almost 1.5 million plus number of refugees and internally displaced people who are almost in a state of double lockdown, prevented from even leaving their tents and attempting to survive a very, very tense and uncertain period of time in even more debilitating and difficult situations. At the moment in Iraq, we have about, actually, last night when I was preparing the figures, we had 1,232 people who were infected. As of this morning, we have 1,279 people. That's a spike of 47 people overnight. The number of deaths across Iraq was 69 last night. This morning, it reached 70. So the numbers are increasing, although relative to the number of other countries, it's actually quite low. People, at least in the northern parts, in the Kurdistan regional government, have been praising the government in relation to its effective measures in implementing quarantine, in threatening to basically arrest anyone that would break curfew. And this is in light of a situation where the governments in the region have been extremely ineffective, have been almost debilitated with intense amounts of corruption and nepotism. So this is one measure that is considered by the majority of people here to be actually effective. And so there's a high level of support, to some degree, high level of support for the quarantine measures that are being placed. We've had no testing kits, aside from the fact that China in late February and early March sent a number of shipments of testing kits. We have at the moment in the Kurdistan regional government about 1,000 testing kits, which is extremely, extremely low for a population about 6 to 7 million people in the north. It's horrendously low. At the same time, though, testings are for free, whereas in comparison in Iran, testing cost the average person about 600,000 Iranian lira, which is about $142.50. Huge amounts for the average person to be able to pay. And most people will not be able to pay, especially in light of the fact that there have been sanctions in place in Iran, huge amounts of economic decline. We've seen huge numbers of protests across Iran in late 2019 in relation to the lack of support and development in relation to economic situation of Iran. Now, we've had similar processes in place. We've had quarantine. We've had the quarantine placed in place in Iraq in late February, about 24th of February, after the first person was diagnosed, having returned from Iran on the 22nd of February. However, quarantine was not actually put into place until here in the northern parts until the 13th of March. We had a 48-hour notice, quarantine put into place, then it was extended by another 48 hours, and then eventually it was extended to longer periods of time. And now we are assuming that we're going to be in quarantine until April, at the end of April. There have been roadblocks put into place. There have been issues in relation to the two Kurdish political parties in the north here, where the zones that they control are, there's actually borders put into place. Trenches dug to prevent people from attempting to travel. There have been issues where one of the cities, Duhok city here, was about to declare that its city was free of quarantine, but then as a result of nepotism and corruption, a family who had returned from UK was snuck into the city, and it turned out that all members of the family were infected with COVID, and that resulted in a continuation of the lockdown. So the situation has been exacerbated by a lack of consistency, by lack of information. The Kurdistan regional government has attempted to try to implement as much information across social media. There's been a lot of protest, both across Iraq and here in the Kurdistan regional government, because of lack of trust towards the government. Some people have claimed that this is a hoax. Some have claimed that this is just a Western imperial threat or something that the government is trying to use in order to silence protesters, particularly in relation to the Tahrir Square protesters, which the COVID has had a catastrophic impact on and has basically completely shut down that process, which was in the process of actually gaining momentum and gaining a lot of influence in relation to changing the corrupt government and bringing about systematic and institutionalized change. Iran, on the other hand, has responded completely differently. It has not implemented any form of quarantine measures. It has not implemented social distancing. It has not implemented any form of lockdown, and communities and people are continuing to go about their lives as a result of this situation. There have been a worrying number of responses. There has been, in the last week or so, thousands of detainees, prisoners, who have been protesting against the government because hundreds of them have been infected by COVID. And in response, the government has responded by actually shooting, using live ammunition, and using tear gas to silence the protesters. As far as we know, up to now, about 35 people have been killed as a result of these protests. The government of Iran has stated that the COVID pandemic is actually a ploy by the enemy, by Iran, or a Zionist effort to implement divisions and to ferment dissent within Iran. It has not implemented any sort of a shutdown of mass religious gatherings. The first person who was infected in Iran was in the city of Qum, in the religious sites of Qum. During this entire period, this person was infected in about March. and in late February, sorry, and it wasn't until March 17 that the government attempted to limit or prevent people from visiting these religious sites. Meanwhile, there were direct flights through the mullahs, religious leaders' own airline, flying religious students from China to Tehran who were coming and going to the religious side of Qom. Iran is actually being accused of infecting about 15 other countries, including Iraq. Now that has impacted the socio-political and economic situation here in Iraq, because there's already been significant amounts of tension towards Iran. There's been significant amounts of fear in relation to Iran fomenting conflict and war, basically World War III, with the United States on Iraqi soil, especially in relation to the killing of the Iranian general Qasem in late October 2019. Iran initially did not implement any sort of measures, any sort of a testing. It actually kicked out Doctors Without Borders and prevented them from building a 50-bed, only 50-bed for a population of 80 million hospital in the city of Isfahan. Now Iran is actually asking the International Monetary Fund for about 5 billion of funds to bail itself out and to use it in order to implement testing, hospitals, infrastructure. However, the Trump government is actually blocking this and vetoing this effort in the International Monetary Fund. At the same time, the European Union is attempting to provide about 222 million euros to Iran in order to get itself out of this situation. Now, Iran at the moment is claiming that about 68,000 people are infected, and about 4,200 and so number of people have lost their lives. However, activists on the ground are saying that these numbers are actually much, much higher. We're also getting a similar feel here in Iraq in relation to suppression of numbers. We don't actually know the number of people who have been killed, who have lost their lives. We don't actually know the number of people who have been infected. Iraq recently, just about late last week, threatened the World Health Organization because the World Health Organization was claiming that Iraq is suppressing the numbers. And so the response of the Iraqi government was to actually fine WHO here in Iraq and threaten to kick them out of the country. So there's a huge number of suppression. In relation to the responses of communities, both in Iran and in Iraq here, it has followed a particular process. Three particular methods have been identified so far. One, it's as a result of unsystematic and unorganized activity from individuals and people who are trying to come together using social media to provide some sort of support. Two, it has been through well-known individuals, famous individuals, actors, famous people across society who have financial means to implement their own measures to provide support to communities, or as a result of political parties and individuals or leaders within political parties attempting to generate further support for themselves by implementing particular healthcare measures. Now, this has not been an effective way of supporting people. We've had groups who have gone and provided aid door to door and taken photos of people who have received the aid. This has generated a lot of discussion and criticism across society. And so there's been a lot of issues in relation to Iran and Iraq. Some, prisoners in Iran, for example, women's groups have attempted to educate society. Anyone who has attempted to raise awareness about what's happening in Iran has been arrested. Doctors who have attempted to provide free care in secret in hospitals have been arrested and detained. Now, I'm being told by Rachel that my time is up, so I'm going to stop there. I'm so sorry. I know I had 2 countries to go through, and it probably was a bit of a disjointed presentation, but if anyone has any questions, I'll just try to answer more in depth in the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hoishin. Thanks very much. That was a great talk. And yeah, we've got some time now for discussion. We're going to open it up for the audience. We'll take 3 questions, and people can put on their cameras, and if they can speak into the camera so we get to know you during the questions, that'd be great. And then we'll open it back up to the speakers to respond. And online we have Kuma, Kavita, and Hoishin.